Hello everybody, welcome to video number 1 for my Dungeons & Dragons fan art series, where I try to draw a both faithful and a original take on the monsters from the various monster manuals. Today we're going to be starting with the Almiraj, which is explained as a simple bunny with a unicorn horn. So it's not going to be something so complex or complicated, it's just going to be a small, I guess you can call them filler monsters, something that you would normally encounter when you're going across various forests and wood settings. Maybe these are the ambient kind of creatures that just roam about and take place into your various settings. These challenge rank 0 monsters, not typically battle hardened veteran monsters. They're mostly just the ones that are going to be as I said before, just filler. If your player characters decide to be so cruel as to harm them, these will be the monsters that they can use as fodder. So, the tools of my trade are pretty basic, honestly. When I do my sketching process, it just comes down to a regular mechanical pencil. You see number 2 pencil with a .07 lead. My eraser that I use is the high polymer eraser, which is just a regular white eraser. You can get them anywhere, like at a dollar store or such and such, for like not very expensive. The notebook that I'm using for this is just going to be a sketchbook that you can pick up anywhere that you can find sketchbooks. For the most part, a lot of sketchbooks, in my opinion, do make a difference. So there's some sketchbooks that are, you'll notice the pages are rigid, or they're kind of like a tannish color. Those I don't really like too much because I feel as if they trap oils more and it makes it harder to erase. If I were to make a line with this pencil right here and just erase that right away, you can't really see any artifacts from behind it where I just drew it. You'd have to draw pretty hard in order to make something that's not going to be erasable. For example, if I were to draw with a bit more pressure on this side and I try to erase that, there's a little bit of a remnant there, but also it's not too much of an eyesore. Again, this is just something to consider when buying sketchbooks, to find one that works for your preference and taste. For me, I just like the ones that are just plain white, almost like printer paper. They're not very thin, they have a little bit of thickness to them, but also they are comfortable for me to draw with. And again, to each their own for preference. So let's go ahead and get started. The Almiraj is described as a large timid rabbit with a 1-foot long spiral horn emerging from its forehead. So this creature, when threatened, will attack by trying to spear people with its horn. I do not assume that this is one that's going to be plotting and planning like a raptor or something, trying to hedge you off or flank you. It's just I guess it's its own defense mechanism to kind of deter any threat. So it's basically just a rabbit with the horn. So let's go ahead and get into that. One of the first things I do in my process is I try to find some reference for the creature that I'm drawing or something I'm working on. In this case, it's a rabbit, so I'm going to be looking at rabbit reference pictures, and I could probably pull one up just to show kind of what I'm using for pose reference. A lot of the poses that I draw are variations of what I've seen online, so I would say that it's very hard to come up with a pose that's 100% imagination, and at least some aspect of it is taken from reference, in the sense that the body of an animal or even a person kind of works a little bit differently than what we would assume. So, for example, rabbits, in their anatomy, they appear to have elongated feet, at least in the back portion. So I can draw a little quick anatomy sketch of a rabbit here that I've pulled up. So basically you have your head, which is kind of like a traditional creature head, something like that. The neck appears to bend and have a couple points in it. And the part that's unintuitive is that your clavicle or your shoulder bones for your rabbit would be kind of protruding like this, where your shoulder ends up around here and your bone is kind of like that. So again, just moving forward with some of the anatomy of it, I'm just going to go ahead and kind of draw this out here. This is your upper arm. This would be your forearm. And then here you have your wrist bones. and then from there you have your toes or your fingertips. I'm sure there's an anatomically correct word for this, but this is in particular what I mean when I'm saying that rabbit anatomy, or even creature anatomy in general, is a bit unintuitive, so it's always best to have some sort of form of reference with what you're doing. So I'm going to go ahead and move along to the rib cage. And rib cage is relatively small compared to the body. Let's see. Here's my back of the spine. And then the hips appear pretty large. Let's see. I'm going to do my leg. There's the knee right here. And then I'm going to go ahead and do a kneecap. Now, when creating creatures, you're not really going to be seeing all these bones unless that's your intention to make a skeletal version of a creature. But it does help to have some form of grasp of what the anatomy is actually doing underneath the surface of all the fur and skin, because that's going to help you with your poses if you can just reduce things down to the simplest of forms. So as you can see, that's essentially the form of a rabbit right here. And let me go ahead and draw the tail back there too. So another thing I can see is that rabbits actually have a tail beneath all the fluff, which is kind of, again, unintuitive. So going ahead and fleshing out the face, I guess boning out the face just a bit more to see what's going on in there. From there we have a basic kind of rabbit shape. So when we go ahead and draw the outer outline of it, we're going to see how it actually starts to take form and looks like a rabbit when you draw the fur on top of everything. So here's my arm. Here's my little feet right there. And you see the kind of fluffiness of it hides a lot of the figure, so you're going to see, like, you know, I'm just going to outline this right here so you can kind of get a feel of what's going on. Now this is all kind of new to me. I don't actually typically draw rabbits. So animals have never really been my strong point, but again, having strength in anatomy, the way the skeleton forms and the way the muscle grooves form, is going to help a lot, immensely, with just drawing anything. Because if you can figure out where the bones go, you can just draw around it and essentially make your own creature that can fool the eye into believing that it is what it actually is. So again, I'm just going to draw the back of this, come back down a bit. Here's where our fluff ball would be. And there we go. So now you can see that underneath all this fur, you have a rabbit. So that's going to help a lot with understanding how this rabbit's going to take place when we start to draw other things on it. I mean, I could typically just, or technically just draw a horn right here protruding from the skull and just be done with it and say, hey, that's your Almiraj, but that'd be kind of cheap. So you can see, though, let me zoom in just a bit here. You can definitely see that where the top portion of the skull is, we can automatically know where a horn would most likely appear. And again, this has to do with the way the skull anatomy is. If you were to just draw a rabbit without bone reference or some sort of knowledge of it, it kind of would be a little bit tricky to estimate the placement of where this horn is supposed to go. But again, all horns are just extensions of bones. So this would typically be where it fits, and if you can see the silhouette of it, it looks like it would it'd fit. So moving along, now that we have a bone reference for this rabbit, this Almiraj, I'm going to go ahead and try to grab a pose really quick of something that's a bit pleasing. And I see one already that I like, so I have this pulled up. I'm just going to do rough shapes just to get the feel of it. when doing poses, again, it's always your preference of what you like. For myself, I like dynamic poses, and I think they're more appealing. A still pose would help to kind of get the idea of, I guess, where colors would go, where certain structures would go. Like, say if this had shoulder pads or something, I'm not saying it would, but I mean, if it had some battle armor or something, you would kind of know it would go across the body like this, and you'd be able to kind of, plan for that when you're drawing your next creature or something. So, like a little back suit or something like that. And then when you do your dynamic pose, it'd be a lot easier to kind of work with that and figure out, like, hey, since I have my shoulder right here, my neck is right here, I can plan out where the rest of this thing is supposed to be going. So static poses can help in determining that, but a dynamic pose is best for showing the emotion or impression of the character or creature you're trying to create. So for an Almiraj, I imagine them just hopping through the woods and kind of just, having a good time. So this is something that I feel like this pose is definitely one that I can picture this Almiraj doing. So ta-da. And now that we have our anatomy, we have our pose, we can go ahead and begin to draw this in a larger scale with more personality and more life to it, so it actually seems like an Almiraj that we want to have in our campaign. I'm going to have this top, what I'm drawing, I'm going to draw a bit down here, but just know that it's still there. We can kind of reference back and forth at it to see how close I'm following my reference and what's going on. So I'm going to go ahead and get into the drawing a bit, and I may time-lapse this part depending, but I'll stop every once in a while on a part that seems reasonable to kind of explain the complicated process that's happening. So, briefly, I'm going to kind of explain the messiness of what's going on with our little chicken-looking bunny right here. I haven't done the arms just yet, but I also do want to explain that you can see how I kind of lightly drew the skull and the eye sockets as well as where the horn placement goes. I did a cross technique, which is you draw the rough shape of where your head's supposed to go, and you have a line that goes straight down the middle and across where the eyes would fit, and roughly try to keep it as three-dimensional as possible. So you see this is kind of like a half sphere that just goes all the way around the back and then up across, and then right in the middle of where this goes and where the middle of this curve follows is where we can kind of set our eye and our horn placement, as well as the nose, and we can be relatively comfortable with knowing that's the middle of our creature. So again, following the neck, following the rib cage, following the spine, you have the tail right here, and again, since we're not going to be seeing the hips so much in this creature with this pose, it's not necessary to have drawn that in excruciating detail, but it is helpful to know this is where the thigh bone begins and where the knee starts right here, as well as where the shin kind of goes down and where the ankle and the rest of the toes can go. And again, this one's kind of obscured in the back, but it's the same thing: thigh bone to the knee, to the shin, as well as to the ankle and to where the toes are going to go. So we'll go ahead and go back into the time lapse, but again, that's why it's very helpful to know the anatomy a bit, so you can draw the fluff on top of it and kind of hide our wonkiness of this back leg that might actually be in the pose reference that we might not have seen until we try to tackle it. So So I'm gonna go ahead and stop here again just to show you more of the fleshing out process. You can see that I initially had my bone coming this way like an S shape and then coming out that way, but I drew the leg as a curve coming this way. Trick that you can do to make sure that things look aesthetically pleasing even though they may not be anatomically correct is to follow a sort of rhythm and flow. So you can see I have my rhythm line coming straight down the back up here, and it curves through the body, comes down through the tail, and makes that swirl right here. So you can kind of trace this at one smooth flow, and it has that nice aesthetic round shape that kind of shows where the motion of this creature is going. And following that as well, if I wanted to take this rule a bit further, it seems my horn would be more aesthetically pleasing to come out possibly this way, or maybe even this way. So simple things like that is going to change the way the flow of this looks by making sure the whole piece is one unit. And then you can see that might have made a bit of a difference. Maybe you didn't even notice it, but still, just things to kind of keep in mind, just little tricks to, as I said, hide your mistakes. I made the arms a bit fatter, fluffier, you could say, to emphasize the fact that this is a pudgy creature that's not going to really be harassing your party as much. It's just going to be something that's kind of, kind of just there. So I'm going to go ahead and clean this up just a little bit before I start making some final details into it. And really quickly, I just want to mention that you may notice the line weights that I'm doing are different in various areas. I try not to draw my lines the same thickness or even a heavier thickness until I'm fully done and comfortable with the pose and what I've decided to commit to. So you could still see that in the skull there's some very faint lines up here, even fainter where the cheekbones of the rabbit go. And you can see it's kind of messy down here, but also that this line for sure I want dark. And even here this line's a bit different, it's lighter, and that is to make things easier to erase, so that way you can be able to clean things up in the sketching process and figure out where you really want things to end up going. But also for the same fact that it's the quality of paper that you're working on, and even again, this is just a cheap sketchbook, that is going to make the difference in whether or not you can actually erase these lines without it making a complete mess of your work. So again, play around with your sketchbook and your line weights to figure out if what you're doing is something that's going to agree with your style. I'm very heavy-handed, and learning how to sketch lightly has been the thing that's made a difference in my art, in the sense that I can actually plan where I want the heaviest lines to be, and I'm using that as an advantage. So now that this rabbit's a bit cleaned up, let me zoom out. We can start adding some details that really make it our own. So as of now, this is just a rabbit with a horn, so that's something that the Almiraj is supposed to be, but I kind of want to make it a bit unique, and we can do that in the coloration of the fur, the markings on the fur. I did this with the ears. I made them a bit long, in the sense that this is a fantasy creature, so I assume with fantasy things are always just extra. So ears are longer, the fur is fluffier, the tail is bigger, and the rabbit's arms are fatter. So things like that I think will bring out the more of a fantasy aspect to this. So I kind of have the ears thin at the bottom and kind of flare out a bit at the top, and let's see if we can actually make a nice little pattern of this and have it on the tip. So this would be something that we can now. At this stage I'm a bit more committed to my lines, so I'm going to be drawing a bit heavier, just because I'm pretty sure, fairly certain, that I'm going to keep these lines as is. Again, with the rhythm and flow kind of theory, I'm going to have this be really sharp right here, but then kind of round out to kind of complement the sharp point of it. Same thing right here. in between lines, especially on the outer edge of your character, you want it to be a bit thicker to separate the canvas space from the actual figure you're drawing. That way it's more easy to pick up for the eye to see what it is they're looking at. Another bit of technique is that you can kind of have the back portion of these lines be much more thicker than the inner portions, simply to give the effect that this is has its own shadowing of a sort. So I want these ears to be kind of nice and flat without any texture to them, but I do want my rabbit to have a bit of cheek fluff that kind of comes off right where the edge of that cheek is. So you can see that's a good thing why I kept that kind of there without erasing it, because now I can see where my cheek fluff can go. As well as I can start planning for where to put my markings. I'm going to go ahead and draw the bottom of the neck before it gets into the fur a bit thicker down here, so we know there's a difference between where the fur goes and where the neck ends. Start there. So kind of come up and around. You can see I'm varying where my pencil's going just to kind of give texture to the fur itself. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of do like upstrokes like that, just to kind of distinguish the difference of the line weights, to kind of really give the appearance that this is fur that we're dealing with. And then we'll go ahead and clean up the face a bit more. It's starting to look a bit messy. Put a little bit of a thickness on the bottom here, so you can tell that's where the mouth ends. Round out this portion of the face. Okay, I'm going to start working on the horn. I kind of bend down a little bit inward so it looks like it's actually coming from its head. I kind of still see faintly on my page where it should go. So I'm going to go ahead and add a bit of kind of a little bit of a looks spirally kind of shape to it. And I'm going to kind of wiggle my lines on the way down so it doesn't look like it's just a perfect straight horn. It looks like something that's going to be more unicorn in nature. Now, this is where you can be up to your own taste and have a little bit of a cuteness factor into the eyes. I'm going to draw a little bit of an eyelid like that makes it look more cutesy. We're going to shade that in a bit. And then I'm going to work on this foot. And right here is another portion too. That's another technique just to keep in mind. Whenever you have what's called a tangent, which is where a lot of lines meet together. So for example, you see the bottom of the chin is meeting with the fur right there, as well as the neck, as well as the arm. It's kind of messy and hard to read, and it ends up looking like a blob that's kind of distracting. So one of those tricks is to find out where the line is that you can move and make sure you clearly define that gap where you break this tangent and allow more breathing room in the piece. So from there, I'm going to go ahead and detail the foot. So I'm going to keep that. Here's my arm. Another thing I want to do really quick is go ahead and flare out some bits of fur where the shoulder and the elbow should meet. In the same manner I kind of did the cheeks, that we know that there's fluff going on here and it's not just straight limbs coming out of it. just subtle. This is something that's going to be a bit up to preference as well. For me, I'm not going to get too big into perspective, so I'm going to kind of fudge it a little bit and make it a bit busy right here so you can't exactly tell what's going on with the foot. I'm not going to lie on that. But again, this is just a quick drawing, so it's nothing that's going to be super complicated, complex. So moving along to the back portion of it. I want my belly of the rabbit to be a bit thicker in the line weights, just because that's the bottom of the figure and it's not going to be something that we're going to see anyway, so I want to be able to clearly define, distinguish that's where the bottom is. So here's our knee. I'm going to round this out. Give a little bit of a fluff to where the hip meets. I'm going to go down to here. Just point it up right here just to create the illusion that this leg is coming from the thigh. Again, the good thing about anatomy is finding out where you can have features. So on this one, the rabbit has pads on its foot. So knowing where the foot bone is and where the metatarsals, is the technical definition I believe, toes are, you can estimate where the pads of the foot should be. So I'm just going to do a couple of them. You kind of have that appearance there. Maybe something like that. Of course, we could look at rabbit foot references to find out specifically what this foot is supposed to look like, but for the most part, it gets the job done. You have that. And again, right here, between where these legs are, I want to give the illusion this one's underneath it, so I'm going to make this one a bit thicker in line weight. Same thing as the other one. I'll keep this relatively simple, so not to distract from the rest of the drawing. And kind of pads of our foot. And then we have the tail, which could be anything. Honestly, this tail could be fluffy, it could be sharp, it could just be a string that has some sort of, you know, I don't know, maybe like a glowing bulb on it or something that's, you know, unique to a cave. This is going to be a cave dwelling rabbit, or maybe this is going to be something that has, you know, kind of peacock feathers attached to it or something cool like that. So, you know, let's go ahead and do something like that. Let's go ahead and add a more fantasy element to this. So I'm going to add a kind of like, you know, these little gem appearing things are going to be going around the collar of this rabbit. Just kind of give it more of a fantasy look. And for the tail, we can go ahead and have the same thing where we have at least, you know, a little big of a gem right here, another one right here, another one kind of right there. And you can kind of go ahead and add some detail onto these so it seems like they're a part of this creature. And let's go ahead and add them to the ears. Why not? You can already see this is coming together. It looks unique as it is already. You can add more of the fluff kind of strokes. Yeah. And let's see what else we can do. We can go ahead and add our patterns to the fur, so I'm going to go ahead and pick something that looks relatively simple. Which I see there's some eye patterns that come straight down from the ear. We're going to blend it into our cheek there. And let's see, maybe we can give it some socks or something. Come all the way up to the point. And same for this one, we'll give it some socks that just kind of follow that roundness of the thigh. And then maybe a little bit of a back coat. Just kind of meet up right there where that shoulder goes. Go ahead and sketch these in very gently. Whenever I do sketches like this, just for the most part, I just do simple, evenly spaced downstrokes in various directions, just to kind of give the illusion of shading, or at least a different color that you can't really perceive with just a simple pencil stroke. But if you layer it enough, you alternate enough, you can kind of guess that there's some sort of color there. So we're going to go ahead and do that to distinguish the patternings from the rest of the rabbit. Add some finishing touches, just making the outline of this Almiraj a bit thicker, once again to allow the eye to clearly see where this figure is. Looks about done. So there we go. This is our Almiraj. You can see, again, zooming out at the rest of our reference, how much it helped us. We have our pose up top, which I was glancing back and forth at constantly to figure out how this jump was going to happen. You can see there's some parts that are a bit different, and I can see that here where the shoulder is and the neck is, there's a little bit less distance than I put over here, but I tried to have a more fluffy mane to, you know, fit my vision of what this character is. And again, that could be a fancy artist way of saying that I made a mistake there. So it's up to you on how you want to interpret that, but if it visually looks good, then that's I guess that's the goal we're working for. So once again, bone structure and anatomy is very important, figuring out how these limbs are going to move. So even though this arm is a bit out of place compared to where this pose reference is, as well as this leg is slightly working differently than we wrote up there, you can see that I was using the bones that I had drawn underneath to give myself a reference of how this should look in my head. So that's going to help in determining what you want to do with your creature, your character, with anything, honestly. It's just a matter of figuring out the anatomy and how you can break things down into their most basic shapes, as well as what's familiar and what works with that sort of a creature. So there you have it. There's a challenge rank number 0 and Almiraj. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for next time.